Hello, this is Open Indie. We talk to indie game developers. And now we talk to a lawyer. Please don't sue me for singing the intro. Wow, that was bad. If you're still here, my name is Eve from Open Indie. We are an indie podcast, not just because it's Sarah and me running the show with no big budget, but also because we genuinely love the freedom to do things like cutting a badly sung intro into this episode. And honestly, for most of our awesome game dev guests we talked to over the years, that freedom is exactly what makes indie, well, indie. It's a wonderful feeling when a publisher shows interest in the game you poured your heart and soul into. But you can't have the support and money without commitments and responsibilities. You just can't. Trust me on that one. And, as so often in life, things can get complicated pretty fast. That's where today's guest comes in. My wife Sarah sat down with René Otto, founder of Deviant Legal, a law firm built entirely for the games industry. They talked through his Game Developer's Guide to Publishing Agreements and tackled some of the questions you guys sent over via Blue Sky. The guide is 100% free, no strings attached, on the Deviant Legal website. You can find the link in the show notes. I really hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we loved recording it for you. And as always, have fun listening.
Hello, René. Nice to have you on the show. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Could you please introduce yourself at first? Who are you and what do you do?
So my name is René Otto and I'm a video game lawyer. I've been in the industry for around 11 years now. Actually started out at a more traditional law firm where I started as a legal trainee in a pretty general practice. And at one point, I wanted to determine in which direction I wanted to go. And for me, that was video game law, because for me, video games are the most beautiful medium there is. And they always have played a huge role in my life. So I went into the directions of video games, built up the department there, became partner. And at one point, I realized that I actually love doing my work. Mm-hmm. But I don't like traditional legal environments. So I started my own law firm, which is Deviant Legal, which is a boutique law firm focusing exclusively on the video game industry. Currently, we work with over 300 developers, publishers, and other companies who are part of our beautiful sector. And what we try to do is to make legal more accessible for them. So we believe that everyone should have access to a lawyer, regardless of your size, your business, or your background, and also for your budget. So we try to make legal at least we can't really make it more fun, but at least more accessible to an audience, because I know there will be a lot of indie developers listening who believe lawyers are formal, elitist, dusty. While with Deviant Legal, we try actually to build a game dev studio that happens to give legal advice.
What's your favorite game, by the way?
Oh, then we can fill a podcast episode with that, because the hard part is that it changes for me a lot. Franchise-wise, The Legend of Zelda is a top game for me. But also, Pokemon. I grew up with Pokemon. Everyone that looks at my LinkedIn profile quickly discovers a Gengar. So I just love it. But for me, I always have short-term favorites. So I'm currently, every day I work, I listen to the OST of Expedition 33, while now we are playing Resident Evil Requiem. Yep. So I'm pretty vibe oriented. And after an open world game, I want to play something linear. After something linear, I want to play something open world. Then we have horror, and I will start perhaps Pokemon Pocopia afterwards. Okay. That's a big contrast to Resident Evil Requiem. So from that perspective, it's always different. It's too hard to choose.
Do you also play indie games when you have time?
Quite a lot, actually. Also something that I try to do for my work a lot as well, because whenever I work together with an indie game developer, I always say I prefer not to negotiate a publishing agreement before I first play the build.
Okay.
And as soon as you are also involved with the beautiful craft of making an indie game, it also becomes a little bit of your baby. So there are so many different games that I played lately, like the Nightling from Trollbound, Goblin Cleanup, but also various also unannounced indie games. And that's perhaps the biggest benefit of doing my work, playing games that aren't out yet and seeing how they evolve from such an abstract, passionate idea to something in the hand of players.
Wow, that sounds great.
In that regard, I'm a bit jealous when I look at the game developers, because let's be honest, I know enough about Unity, Unreal, and Godot engine to do my work as a lawyer. But whenever I open them and use them, I blow them up.
Don't worry, I think you're perfect as a lawyer, so I think the developers are happy for your work and what you do for them. It's definitely great to have you here on the show today, René. And I have to say, also welcome to our first edition of our new format, Behind the Build. The idea is to dive into specific aspects of game development, uncover useful insights, and fetch expert tips, like from experts like you.
No pressure.
Today, we're going to dive into contracts and contract negotiations with publishers. So having a publisher is a dream for every indie dev with a tight budget, I think. So there's, for one, the financial aspect, but also, as we were told by some indie devs, they are really happy that a publisher takes over such annoying tasks like marketing. So some devs really don't want to do that. So it's really beneficial. But the most important question is, what contracts should you sign, and also which aspects are important to negotiate? And that's something I would really love to explore with you today, René.
Yeah, and I would love to also help give developers an overview of what to look out for. And perhaps the most important thing to start with is already in your intro, because I see a lot of indie developers who really believe that, like, an offer from a publisher is kind of a gift from heaven. They really see it as an honor. And of course, to a certain extent, that really is the case. But what I often see is that subsequently, when you need to negotiate a deal, they still see it like a gift or someone doing you a favor, while at the same time, you're equal partners. It's an equal business opportunity. And I believe that at least developers should also treat it as such, because I always say that a contract is not only important to make sure that all the legal nitty-gritty details are in place, but I always say that a contract is also a kind of a roadmap for a collaboration. And the contract phase is the perfect phase to iron out assumptions that you have. Because, of course, you've had a publishing scout. The publishing scout loves your game, because in the end, it's also the task of a publisher scout to love your game. And you're talking about dreams and opportunities. And that's all great, because I would say that's almost like the dating phase. But then when things get serious, it's very important to also iron out all assumptions you have. And I always say there's no better way to iron out assumptions than by putting it in writing. So also from that perspective, it's very important that indies take it seriously, and also that they're not scared to negotiate, because I hear a common myth like, oh, a publisher will be angry when I will negotiate a deal. And I would beg to differ. One, if they become angry, I think that's perhaps the biggest cultural red flag that you have in publishing contracts. But also subsequently, I also represent a few publishers, and some of them even believe that it's a red flag when you don't negotiate a publishing contract.
Oh, okay.
Because they're like, hey, don't you take our relationship seriously? And if you do it like this with us, are all your contracts like that? So I even have had a few publishers, and one of my clients was one of them, who even put in little Easter eggs in the contract template. And if then an indie just reached out and was like, everything is fine, there's nothing strange, I accept, they're like, are you for real? Yeah, wasn't there anything strange? No, it was standard as standard can be. They were like, but what did you think about Easter egg 1, 2, and 3? And they're like, really? Was it in the contract? And they were like, come on, back, go review the contract. And even for one of them, it was even something like you have something which you call the force majeure clause. So if there something happens like an act of God, what we call as lawyers, so there is a power outage, there is war, or there is something like terrorism, and you can't execute a contract, you can't perform your obligations, you're excused. And in the list of examples of that force majeure, there was also a force majeure clause. It was a company that does a lot of zombie related games, like a zombie apocalypse, when there is a real risk that your brain is eaten, except if you don't have any.
Oh,
Well,
man.
if you read through that contract and you don't get a question mark above your head with that clause, you know that you didn't read it.
Oh, okay. But it's also nice of them to not cancel the whole thing, but to say, hey, we give you another chance. Please review the contract. We really are interested in this relationship with you.
Yeah, and but they also have the experience that sometimes people don't like it when a contract takes long, and of course sometimes it takes longer than it has to. But if it goes too quick, then all things you didn't iron out during the contract phase, you will encounter during the collaboration. But then the annoyance start to pile up, the emotions start to pile up, and the frustration. And the most conflicts I see in a publishing relationship, there were already some signs during the contract negotiation because they quickly skipped over all material stuff, or when you raised the topic, it was met with an immature reaction. So then you already get a few, I would say, cultural, psychological signs, which can be a source of conflict later down the collaboration. So I'm very happy that there are also quite a few publishers who really believe like we should take this seriously before we even go and collaborate.
That's good to know. Yeah, you also published a guide called the Game Developer's Guide to Publishing Agreements. It's free and it's supposed to help developers to make sense of it all. How is this guide designed so that indie devs can better understand their contracts?
So it's a 20,000 word counts guide because if a lawyer writes something, it happens to be lengthy. But it is, I would say, an introduction, also 20,000 word counts and an introduction, who would have guessed, to publishing contracts where we have like one page for each common contract clause in a publishing agreement. And it just answers a few questions like, what is it? Why does it matter? How does it look like? And what are the key points you should take into account when negotiating such clause? So it provides, I would say, some generic information about several important clauses so that a game developer can actually do their homework. The reason that we developed this guide is that we personally, as Deviant Legal, we are annoyed that a lot of knowledge is scattered or hidden behind the paywall. Because let's be honest, we love our video game events, we love Gamescom, we love Nordic, but we also know that there are a lot of indie devs who do not have the funds to travel, to attend. And I found it a pity that those developers didn't have access to these resources. So that's why I drafted the guide to make sure that it's accessible to anyone.
Nice.
And of course, there were like independent articles, like 5 key points to look into your contract, but that was also still pretty fragmented. Or you needed to leave behind your personal data, which we also don't really like because, let's be honest, nobody wants to give away their email address only to get some information.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows you get spam afterwards.
Exactly.
So that's why we just had a public guide available through our websites so that anyone can just read on it. And next to like the breakdown per clause, there are also a few other articles who are more topical. So which one discusses red flags, the other one common myths, also a clause what the advantages of engaging a lawyer, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, cool. Yeah, could you maybe describe some typical red flags or just an example?
The fun thing is that I need to give like a typical lawyer answer. It depends. And why does it depend? Because of course, I've seen very strange clauses in my life. But if I would write an article in a guide about that one time that I found a horror clause in an agreement, I would make a whole community scared based on something that I've only seen once in my life.
Okay.
So those excesses, if we throw those out of the window and we look at what is a common red flag, it's not really one specific clause to watch out for, but more how different clauses work together. So one thing I would really watch out for is what we call a termination for convenience. That's a legalese way to say that the publisher has a contractual right to terminate a publishing agreement whenever they want and for every reason they want. That can be a very risky clause on itself already. There can be some sense into it. And of course, if I need represent a developer, I want to either remove it or to make sure that a developer never needs to repay anything after the kill switch has been pressed. And you even get a compensation so that you have budget to find a different publisher. But if that clause is in, that clause has always an extra effect in combination with other clauses. So in the past, I've seen a situation where an indie developer was developing a game. They had a milestone schedule. So for the people who don't know, if you enter into a publishing contract, you quite often don't get the money in one installment, but there are several development achievements you need to hit. And as soon as you hit it, you unlock the next installment of the money. But then you have had situations where the developer who didn't unlock those achievements and failed the development task that they had. And the publisher was like, yeah, we can give you additional money, but now the project is becoming risky for us as well. So as a safeguard, we want you to transfer the IP rights of your game to us. And then you get additional money. Then we continue, because if you ever go bankrupt, we can still continue and finish the game. And in this specific instance, that agreement also had that termination for convenience, so the kill switch. And there was a change of management, and they didn't really like the project, and they killed the project. And as a consequence, that game developer didn't have any money, but they also didn't have their game anymore. And it's those strange combinations that sometimes can be a very red flag.
Yeah.
Or one thing I would at least watch out for, and perhaps that's also quite a red flag, is what we call the perpetual license. So normally you have the IP rights to your game. So you're the only one who can release it, who can port it, who can make sequels, prequels, and spin-offs. Because if you have the IP rights to your game, you're the only one who can make it available and base products on it, on the materials. Like a publishing agreement, or is essentially a kind of a license agreement. So you are permitting the publisher to use your game to publish it and to market it. A publisher should not be allowed to do that because you own the IP rights, but because you give the publisher permission, they're allowed to do that. However, some of those agreements do not say that it's a license for the term, but that it's a perpetual license. So it's an everlasting license. And that could also mean that even if the contract is terminated, you don't have an active relation anymore, they still have that exclusive license to release the game. And then you're always tied to that specific publisher. So that's at least something I would always stand up against. Because if the collaboration is not really what you want and the other one has the perpetual license, especially if it's exclusive, because if it's exclusive, that does mean that the publisher is the only one that can do it, including yourself. Then you can be locked in a relationship that you essentially do not want.
I see. Okay. In your guide, you also have a dictionary, which is quite cool, to really uncover typical legal terms. Can you give some examples and maybe clear up what these terms mean?
Yeah. We have, of course, I already briefly mentioned milestones. So those are the development achievements that you actually need to hit to unlock the next installment of the money. But also one that's very important to know and is also very it's used in a very confusing way, are what we call the right of first negotiation, the right of first refusal, and the right of last refusal. Those three terms are also included in our dictionary, but I even said in my guide, like, always read the text of the clause to double check what is actually meant, because the usage of those terms are pretty confusing, because sometimes it is named a right of first refusal, but it's actually a right of first negotiation and the other way around. But those are at least important to know. Like I briefly mentioned, most of the time, a developer will retain the IP rights to their game. That's pretty standard. So the horror situation of, hey, a publisher will own the IP and take it away from you, it doesn't happen often. It happened in the story I just told. They only get a license, but that doesn't mean that they cannot exercise control over your franchise, your IP. And they do so through a right of first negotiation, first refusal, or last refusal. So a right of first negotiation is, I would say, the most relaxed one of them all, which means that if you ever want to develop a sequel, a prequel, or a spin-off, or another game like a port, you first need to negotiate with your current publisher to check if you can come to an agreement. And if you can't, you're free to talk with others. It makes sense because a publisher also invests in your game, so it's nice that they're the first person you can talk to. That's different when you look at a right of first refusal and a right of last refusal. What I see as a right of first refusal is that a publisher has the right to publish a sequel, prequel, or a spin-off on what we call predetermined terms. So it can be something like, we can publish that game under the same terms as this agreement. And that's something I don't really like, because then the result of that negotiation is already set. And especially if you're developing the first game in a franchise, of course you have a feeling that it can be something big, but you don't know it for sure. So that also means that naturally you're more inclined to accept terms that you normally would not if you already knew that it would be a huge success.
And even if it then comes to the second or third game, then maybe it makes sense to negotiate then the second and third game separately, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so if you, perhaps you, for the first game, you accepted the lower rev share, and then you found out that your game is actually the next Expedition 33. And then you want to make a sequel to it. And then you're essentially, the publisher's like, I want to publish the sequel to that game. And then they automatically have the right to the terms and conditions of the first contract. While if you could negotiate openly, you would perhaps say like, well, we now know that it's a very huge IP. So I actually want better deal terms.
Yeah.
So that's something I would see as quite a red flag as well.
Okay.
And then you have the right of last refusal, and that's even a totally different one. It's like a publisher that just says to you, you know what, developer? Go out in the open world, negotiate with other publishers. But as soon as you get an offer, you need to come to me with that offer and then say, do you want to publish it under these terms and conditions? Well, there is one advantage of this structure, especially compared to the right of first refusal, is that you have an open negotiation. So you can at least negotiate new terms. But at the same time, it forces you to then offer those terms to your current publisher and see if they want to publish the game under those terms. And that can be a problem when you have, a suboptimal relationship with your publisher. So if you were like, well, they did an okay job on the first game, but I prefer not to work with them anymore, you're still obliged to take those terms someone else offered to you, go to your current publisher and check if they want to release it under those terms. There are some ways to Houdini out of that. So I always make sure that all terms literally need to be matched. And it then sometimes helps you're talking with other publishers to mention that you have a right of last refusal in it.
Okay, yeah.
And then you can always look together like, what can we specifically put in there that the current publisher cannot match, which means that they can't follow up on it. It is also a very good negotiation tool because it forces the publisher you want for your second game to be very tangible and specific. And that's something you want as a developer. Then you can also say like, sorry, hey, I understand that not everything needs to be fleshed out already. But yeah, I have a right of last negotiation. So I'm sorry, you could very much help me to make the relationship very specific. So then you can even blame your current publisher and the clause that's in that contract to actually let the new publisher do something that's super beneficial to you, namely ironing out assumptions, be very specific. So in that way, I don't see that right of last refusal as a real red flag, but it's at least something that you need to make a conscious decision about, especially if you believe that you want to build a franchise, if you want to make sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, if you want to develop one game that will be online for eternity and online multiplayer, it might be less relevant. But in case you really want to build sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, it's important to consider.
Yeah, and it really sounds complicated then when you have like tons of publishers and then tons of agreements, and you always need to go back to your current publisher. So
Yeah, and it's also hard because you perhaps like that new publisher a lot, and you're like, oh, I would love to work with you, and then you still need to go to your current publisher.
Yeah. And ask for permission, kind of.
Yeah, more or less, and that can be hard as well.
So as an indie dev, you should never be scared of negotiating your contracts. Can you also give an example of a chapter in your guide that will benefit indie devs most, or is the complete guide really beneficial?
Yeah, I believe the whole guide is beneficial, but that's also because it's pretty modular. So it's like we go into detail for every clause, and it also really depends on what kind of developer you are, which sections of the contract are very relevant. So like I said before, if you want to build sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, look at the article on future games, for example. But also if you really want to, well, at least know that you can safely port your game to different platforms and how that is dealt with, then perhaps more the clause regarding licenses is important, because that's also one very important thing that I would look into if I was a developer, and that's the license scope. A lot of developers skip reading that part because it feels so legal boilerplate. Yeah, you give a license to a publisher to publish your game and to marketing it. So it feels like yada yada, potato potato. I'm just going to read over it. But that clause is actually very important. What I see a lot is that a game is licensed for all commercial platforms. So you give a license not only for Steam, but also for Xbox, for PlayStation, for Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2. And there is a certain reasoning behind it, because a publisher actually invests in building a game. So they also want to be the publisher that will release any console ports. However, most of the time you only get development budget for the PC version of your game, which means that you do not have budget to develop a Switch port.
Oh, wow. Okay.
What can happen is that you release on PC, you are happy with the sales, and you really want to release on Switch 2.
Mm.
Then you can go to your publisher, and the publisher can say like, well, we also like how your game has performed, but currently we don't feel like porting your game to Switch 2 because our attention is directed to another game in our portfolio currently who does better, or because they also make portfolio decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens then is you still gave away an exclusive license to release the game on Switch 2. What did I just say about exclusive licenses? That means that you're not allowed to do it on your own.
Mm.
You can also not go to a different publisher, say like, hey, I would like to release a Switch 2 port, because you can't give them a license to release it.
Okay.
So sometimes you can then be locked out of various other platforms. So one of the things that I believe is very important, it's also described in my guide, but have a kind of an escape plan in case a publisher does not want to release your game on a specific platform.
Okay. So like a red button you can press.
Yep. that you can at least reach out to a publisher, and if they say no, that, for example, their license for that platform expires. Or perhaps to keep the license scope a little bit smaller, that they only get a license for PC, but that they then get a right of first refusal, which we just discussed, to release it on Switch or PlayStation or whatsoever. Then you still have a way out if they don't want to, because I often see indie devs, and indie devs are mostly dependent on the commercial success of the game they've developed, because they often do one project at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to get as much revenue out of that one game as possible by porting it. And then for a publisher, that's not a priority, because they can get revenue from different sources, and then you're a sitting duck. And that's at least something that I would also look into for every developer. So if I then connect that to my guide, the license scope part and the part about porting, also pretty important to read. Especially also, one thing to consider is that if a publisher does make a port, or they contract a third party to make the port, that you really should look into the intellectual property rights of those ports. Because one of the principles of IP rights is that, for example, the copyright of a game is assigned to someone who created it. So if someone creates a port, the IP rights to that port are owned by the party which ports. Which also means that if the relationship ever ends, you at least want to have some kind of a provision in your contract that either the IP rights to the port were already transferred to you during the contract term, or at least as soon as the contract has been terminated, because otherwise you have a game where you have the IP rights to the PC version, and at the same time you want to continue exploiting your Switch port, and then you find out that you don't have the IP rights to that, and you're actually not allowed to use that port, which could lead to a situation that you actually need to port it again, so that you create a new port where you own the IP rights to.
Okay. So, I mean, is it a non-brainer that developers should always own their own games?
Yeah, I think that's very, very important one. And there's also a no-brainer, but unfortunately, I think it's still important to include in a contract, is that if the relationship with the publisher is ever settled, you get back the store pages. I've seen one situation, and I'm still surprised by it, that it was actually needed, but a publisher that really wanted to extend the relationship. So there was a contract, let's say it was 5 years, and after 5 years, both parties could say go or no go. And the publisher said go, and the developer said no go. I just want to independently continue now. And that publisher was a little bit emotional under that situation, and simply said like, okay, then I will now take your game offline. So they threw the game off Steam, off consoles.
Oh no.
And we were like, why? Yeah, we're not obliged to give you back your game ID. We just needed to cease publishing it. And for all those wish lists that has been built, that was due to your own efforts. So it would be very unfair that you then get all those wish lists and we don't get a rev share. So from that moment onwards, and that was pretty early in my career, I was like, in every contract, there needs to be some clause that deals with the situation that a relationship is settled, and all materials you need to continue should be carefully transferred to you. And it also includes the files of the port, for example, because of course you can have the IP rights, but if you don't have the digital files, the builds, it's also pretty hard to keep exploiting it. To be honest, I've never seen a second publisher putting this trick. But because of that one traumatic situation I've seen, I've just included in every contract.
Of course. Well, it can happen, as you experienced. Thank God, not too often, but still, you need to be careful there. Yeah, it makes sense.
Unfortunately, I said that I wouldn't share too much horror story because they're going to live on their own, and I already told you. I'm so sorry to the people who are listening currently. I hope you don't get any nightmares because most publishers are not evil.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. That's a myth.
Yep.
There are also nice publishers. Also, something you touch upon in your guide is negotiating money. I think that's also a big one. And you mentioned terms like royalty payments, net revenue, and recoupment. What is all this, and what should devs look out for?
Yeah. So what happens in a publishing relationship is that you often get a budget to develop your game, and in return, a publisher will market your game and publish it. And the commercial result is often that you divide net revenue between the two of you. So you get a percentage of the money that is earned by commercializing a game. The percentage that you get is often based on what we call net revenue, but there can be different definitions in a contract because, of course, the more for every lawyer there's a different definition, but quite often it's net revenue, which is actually a calculation of the revenue that is shared between parties. So what you often see, for example, is that it's the money that a publisher receives minus taxes, minus returns, minus discounts, but also often minus various expenditures of a publisher. And that's something that I would always take into account. And that's what we call a recoup. So what you often see is that if a game is released, a publisher will first earn back their investment, and then they only start sharing the revenues. And I believe that the recoup is at least a very important thing to consider. I believe that every developer should get revenue as soon as their game is released. Even if it's only 10%, like a lower amount, but you need to have some kind of sort of budget to keep the lights on.
Yes.
So that's something important to at least negotiate. And perhaps if I take a step back, that's also the overarching thing that I would like to tell developers when they're negotiating. Make sure that you have a budget plan that makes sense. And I know it's an open door, but always check how much budget you really need to develop your game. But also take into account that after the release of the game, we're not done yet. You need to do tech support. You perhaps need to wait until your first royalties pour in because most royalties are dealt with quarterly. So make sure that you know what your burn rate is and that you can actually cover it one way or another. And don't be scared to then ask for that amount of money. I always say on behalf of developers, if you just don't say to a publisher, I want more money, but you say, I need this money to make sure that I'll be afloat to do the tech support you want me to do.
And I need some food.
I also need some food and some electricity, if we can, but then you could at least communicate it as a shared interest, a shared value. So that's a very important thing to consider. With regards to the recoup, so what I said, that the publisher first need to earn back their investment before the revenue share is shared with you, or you get more revenue share, because sometimes you get, like I said, normally it's, for example, you get 50-50 revenue, but until the recoup, you only get 10%. So it can also
Okay.
be a mechanism where you get a little bit at the start and more when a recoup happened. One of the pitfalls that I always watch out for is to check which part of the revenue is used for the recoup. So you would expect that if a game sells 1,000 copies
Mhm.
for $10 each, you have 10K in revenue. You take 30% the Steam cut from it, so you have around 7K left.
Mhm.
You would expect that 7K would go towards the recoup.
Yeah.
However, there are contracts, they don't happen, I don't see them that often, but enough to watch out for it, is that you don't recoup from that 7K, but they are going to calculate which part would go to the developer, and that part is used to go to the recoup, and the part of the publisher is just the publisher's revenue. Lawyers are not good with in math, but it has a very strange effect, namely that your investment is only recouped when the developer share equals the investment. But there's still the publisher part that continuously goes to the publisher,
Mhm.
which means that at the moment the publisher has recouped their investment, they're not break even, they have a big profit. And I really don't believe that's fair. I always believe that the revenue, like the net revenue with the deduction of third-party costs, should go directly towards recoup. And if there's a recoup, then parties will share as equal partners, because otherwise you might have a situation where a publisher has earned twice or three times back their investment before a developer gets any money, or at least the agreed upon percentage. Because let's be honest, if you get 10% until the developer or the publisher has earned back three times their investment, some games don't ever recoup.
Mm.
And if they recoup, you're already almost at the end of the commercial life of a game. And then, woohoo, we get 50% of revenue. Yeah, but there are almost no sales anymore.
Okay.
So that's also a financial thing to really consider.
I see. Okay. You also mentioned already the milestone schedule. Here, I wanted to ask specifically, does this schedule and the type of deliverables, do they need to be crafted carefully so the publisher can't reject them? So, for instance, if a developer sends his or her first build to the publisher and the publisher says, no, that's not what we agreed upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really believe it's important to carefully craft them. I would also suggest to include your game design document as an attachment to the contract, so that it's at least clear what kind of game you've pitched
Mm-hmm.
and what the contents thereof would be. But of course, it's important to carefully draft a milestone schedule. But let's be honest, there's always a level of tension, because game development is also quite iterative.
Mm.
So you don't want to lock yourself in too much so that you can't be creative anymore. But at least you should have a sufficiently tangible milestone schedule so that you can't get rejections on purely subjective criteria of the publisher.
Okay.
But next to the milestone schedule, that's also something that I would deal with in the agreement as a lawyer, because you sometimes draft criteria on the basis of which a publisher can accept or reject.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important to look at that mechanism. What's also important to look at in this context is the approval procedure.
Okay.
So sometimes you see that, for example, a publisher has 15 days after receipt of the build to provide you with either an acceptance or a rejection.
Okay.
However, what I've seen happening a lot is that the publisher is overwhelmed and they do not respond in time.
Oh, okay.
And most contracts either do not include anything about that, or they say like, yeah, if we don't respond, it is deemed to be a rejection.
Oh.
Well, deemed to be a rejection can have negative consequences for you as a developer, because then in that case you didn't deliver. But also what I've seen is that there are indie developers who are like, I need an acceptance to get the next installment of the money. And if a publisher does not respond, and not responding equals a rejection, I do not get my money. And if you then have a publisher who more or less ghosts you or takes way too long to reply, you can run out of money. So what I often advise developers is to make sure that you include a provision that if they do not respond on time, that it is deemed accepted for the purpose of payment only, so that you at least can claim the next installment of the money. Also, to make sure that I keep the interests of the publisher in mind, I include as well that they can still provide feedback on the build, and that you then will take that feedback into account with the next milestone, so that you, in the next development sprint, at least make sure that you listen to the feedback of the publisher and apply it where it makes sense.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. Because even if it's then being rejected because they just don't respond, then you don't know what's wrong with it.
That's also a problem.
Yeah. Also, looking at third-party software like Unreal, Unity, and Godot, in the worst case, it can lead to license fees for the developer, right? Or I don't know, maybe not for Godot because it's open source.
Yeah, the Godot is free, but of course, Unity and Unreal are both commercial packages, so you need to pay a license fee for it. What is important is to make sure that you have a third-party software clause in it, because if you use third-party software, you don't own that software, but you obtain the right to use it. And some publishers do not like third-party software beyond engines, because let's be honest, almost every commercial game is made with a third-party engine. There are some developers who have their own proprietary engine, but a lot of them, you see the Unity, Godot, Unreal. So I don't really see a problem there, but there can also be other third-party software you want to use in your game. And publishing contracts often contain a clause that you need to get approval from the publisher to use it. Why? Because a publisher wants to know if it leads to a cost increase, because potentially they also need a license to that third-party software to be able to publish and market the game.
Okay.
And from that perspective, it might be important for you, if you use a lot of third-party software, to at least make the publisher aware that you're using it, so that you can't get discussions in hindsight that you use a lot of different third-party software. Also, an important thing to consider here, especially with regards to Unreal. Unreal, of course, has a license fee that is a percentage of the revenue that you generate. And it's important to at least make an arrangement with the publisher regarding that one. Because if you look at net revenue, you often see that the net revenue is calculated by taking the money that a publisher receives minus deductibles. And those deductibles are very often expenditures of a publisher and not necessarily expenditures of a developer.
Okay.
So in that case, I always try to include a provision which allows the developer to also make sure that their license fees are deducted when calculating net revenue, which means that we are first going to pay the licenses, then we're going to divide the money together. Because if the license fee is determined by a percentage of the commercial result of a game, but you first divide revenue between parties and then you still need to pay your license fee, it can lead to some adverse effects, especially during recoup, where a developer doesn't see any revenue, but the game does.
Okay. Last point I also wanted to touch upon that you're outlining in your guide is marketing. As I already said, some devs really hate this.
Very strange topic.
Yeah, really. And they're really happy that a publisher takes ownership of this field. But still, I think devs still need to be involved in marketing. So how much do they need to be involved? And also in the publishing agreement, how detailed does the marketing plan need to be?
Yeah, and I always believe that a developer should be consulted because a developer knows their game best. So in that case, it's very important to have regular meetings with your publisher that you can at least provide input. Because if you let a publisher who doesn't understand a game as well as you do the marketing, it will never be the optimal marketing for your game. And also it really helps, for example, that you also join trade shows and be at Gamescom. So from that perspective, your involvement is still necessary, but it's good that a publisher determines the strategy and takes away the largest part of the workload and the responsibility. Marketing is, I would say, one of the most important tasks of a publisher. And I hear a lot of developers say like, well, we don't really need anything included in the contract about marketing because the more marketing a publisher does, the more money it generates. So it's good for everyone, right? And I always beg to disagree, because if a publisher doesn't do marketing, you're locked in a contract, because most of the times you can't really exit the contract, except in case a publisher breaches the contract. So you need an obligation for that. And even if the publisher is pretty good faith, they still have a portfolio. So sometimes it's good to at least agree upon a minimum marketing expenditure or effort to make sure that your game gets the attention it deserves. You have actually 3 different flavors. The first one is the best effort clause, which just means that a publisher will do their legal pinky promise that they will do their best, which I would say is the bare minimum. Should always be included, but still the bare minimum, because it's a very open norm that you can always use in specific situations. But there are 2 more tangible solutions. The first one, of course, is a marketing budget, so that at least a certain amount will be spent on marketing. If you include a marketing budget in your agreement, you have to make sure that only out-of-pocket costs are deducted from that marketing budget. Because otherwise you can have a discussion that, for example, your publisher has an employee called Pete, and Pete earns 4K a month, has worked on your game, so that is being deducted from the marketing budget. So at least agree upon what can be deducted from the marketing budget. That's important. But the best way to go forward is actually to have a specific marketing plan. There is only one problem with including or attaching a marketing plan to a publishing agreement, and that is that quite often when you pitch your game to a publisher and when you enter into a publishing agreement, the game is relatively early in development. So often you have a demo, often you have a vertical slice. Problem with that is that a publisher doesn't necessarily know how they will market your game yet. So it's also pretty hard for them to include a marketing plan as an attachment to the contract in most cases. However, in such cases where a marketing plan is not possible yet, I would at least include a provision that ultimately on a certain date, parties will determine a marketing plan. And that, for example, if that marketing plan, parties do not come to an agreement, so developer and publisher have a different opinion, that there is some way of an exit out of the relationship, because you actually want to know how the game is going to be marketed. And that's an important one to at least determine together.
Yeah, for sure.
But because I've also seen relationships where a publisher happens to do the bare minimum, for example, because your game is a VR game and currently the VR market is relatively difficult. And then they're like, well, we're just going to do the bare minimum because the chance that we will earn back our investment is relatively low. And then a lot of at least vague promises will not be delivered. And that's why at least you need to check that you have a level of agreement that you are comfortable with. Perhaps that's also very important to underline. I do not say that every publishing agreement needs to have a detailed marketing plan. It should at least have sufficient specific commitments on a level that you're comfortable with.
And maybe even the publisher can already outline what they are typically doing in terms of marketing or what their possibilities are. I think that already helps the developer.
Exactly. That's also important.
Cool. We've also received some questions from developers via Blue Sky. We have one question is it ever unnecessary to have a contract reviewed by a professional attorney before signing?
Ooh. I would advise to always let a lawyer look at your contract, because it's very hard for a developer to check a contract and to determine if a lawyer is necessary or not. Because most of the times you require that lawyer to point out what's wrong with the contract. So from that perspective, I would always advise to reach out to a lawyer and to have it reviewed. Of course, if you have a lot of experience in reading contracts, some developers determine to not engage a lawyer, but then still it could be good to engage a lawyer for various reasons, because with publishing contracts, it's not only about what is written, but perhaps even more about what isn't written in the contract and what's lacking. Which, of course, you can read through a contract and believe, oh, it all feels fair to me. But is it sufficiently complete?
Okay.
So from that perspective, I still believe it's worthwhile to have a lawyer. And another reason, and then we almost circle back to what we started with in the beginning, is that there are a lot of developers who still believe that an offer from a publisher is a gift from heaven. And they find it emotionally and psychologically hard to stand up for themselves. And I always believe that a lawyer can do good cop, bad cop together with the developer in a way that a developer can focus on the professional relationship with the publisher, while the lawyer can at least point out the required changes in the contracts. And it also has a different advantage, because I've never seen a publisher getting angry at my comments.
Okay.
But in the event they do, there is one magic trick, and that's just to throw me under the bus. Then you can just say like, well, sorry, my lawyer advised me to raise these points. I'm so sorry, we're still friends, right? So you can just, because I'm expected to do this.
True.
They know lawyers do this. So you can also
You can
focus
also
on the
blame you.
relationship that way.
Yes.
You can blame me. It's all included in the hourly rate, no problem whatsoever. And that sometimes also make it easier for a developer.
I see. That's a good point. And there was also a follow-up question to that one. How do you choose an attorney? How can we as non-attorneys be sure that the attorney we choose is careful and skillful enough?
Oh, and well, there are several things I would take into account. The first thing is, of course, make sure that some lawyer you choose knows the games industry. That really has value. Because, of course, you can reach out to a generalist lawyer and perhaps they can read the contract as a contract. But if you don't know the industry from the inside out, you don't know what is really missing. A lawyer can never tell what was the content of a certain deal, but they have a lot of metadata in their head. They have seen hundreds of deals and they know what general market rates are. They know what is standard. They know how the commercial conditions compare to what you see in the market currently. So that's all I would say extra value a game lawyer can bring. Perhaps even most important thing is find a lawyer, have an introductory meeting with them, and listen to your gut feeling, because a lawyer can be as good as you want them to be. But still, it also depends on, do I really trust this person? Do I like to work with this person? And I would also only select a lawyer in the event that they could provide clarity with regards to costs. And I understand that is often difficult for a lawyer to do so, but there is a magic thing that we all game developers know and master, and that's scoping. Of course, a lawyer cannot say how much cost you will end up spending if a negotiation takes either 1 month or 10 months. But I believe that a lawyer should be able to say, like, hey, I can at least review this contract. I can provide amendments. I can discuss it with you. And I can do one round of feedback of the publisher for this amount. I would never, ever agree on an hourly rate only, because you never know. Are they going to spend 1 hour? Are they going to spend 10? And if you want to have some comfort, just send the draft contract with permission to your proposed lawyer and just say, like, look at this contract. How much time do you think it will take you? How much do you believe it will cost? And in that case, you can get some comfort on a financial level. You can get some comfort on a personal level. And if you also find a lawyer that has enough video game credentials, I believe you cannot make a wrong choice.
Yeah, that's also a good point in terms of budget and costs. In your guide, it also says that legal costs can vary between 800 and 3,000 euro. So I don't know if it can even be less if indie developers, for instance, come up to you and say, hey, can you please just review the contract, or we just have some simple questions. Can it be less? So we just get some perspectives from you?
Yeah, we always try to think along. So sometimes we also agree on a more narrow scope. But of course, we also sometimes have indie developers who say, like, yeah, I even don't have a budget for that. But I would really, you would really help me if you could answer a few questions, and we just agree on a smaller scope. There's one big disclaimer I have to give, is that for some questions indies are asking, I still need to see the whole contract, because they can ask me, René, only look at clause 6. But I only know the full effect of clause 6 if I also look at 7, 8, 9, and 10.
I see. Okay, because they're all connected.
Yep. So sometimes I need to be transparent in advance. But the major thing we try to do to mitigate this problem is, if indie developers receive development funding, we will delay our invoice until the first milestone is being paid. Because what we often saw is that developers will, for example, receive 300K in development funding, but their current bank account is 0. And they're like, well, I have an empty bank account. I'm not going to engage a lawyer. And then we were like, yeah, in the end, for Deviant Legal, the most important thing is how many games we end up realizing. I always say with a little smile, like, I count the amount of credits I have in video games as compared to credits I have on the bank account. Because in the end, our goal is to realize awesome games in a safe and a legally compliant way. And of course, the consequence thereof is that we should all earn a living so that we can keep on eating and having the lights on. But in the end, I would never want to skip on an awesome project only because they do not have the funds yet. So that's at least one thing we really try to do, is to make sure that developers are less scared about the financial impact of hiring a lawyer.
That sounds cool. We've also received a second blue sky question. I think we maybe already answered this one. How can indies retain their creative autonomy? Is that through intellectual property rights?
Yeah, it's important to retain the IP rights, because then at least the game remains yours. If you also want to retain creative autonomy, it's very important to check the contents on the publishing agreement on the milestone schedule. We already briefly discussed it, because if a publisher can reject your milestone based on subjective criteria, that also means that they violate your creative autonomy, because then they can say, I don't like this, I want it different. And then we go in a matter of taste, and you lose some of your creative freedom. Another thing to watch out for is how publishers deal with suggestions. So some publishing contracts contain provisions that the publisher can do suggestions for your game. Makes sense. Happy that publishers do so. However, it's more important to check, what you are forced to do with that feedback, because apparently you are obliged to take their feedback into account. But I've also seen one contract where it was like, yeah, and a publisher gives feedback, you're forced to do it, and if you don't do it, we will do it on your costs. That sounds like there is little creative freedom. So try to avoid that one. Of course, always allow a publisher to give feedback. They also mostly know what they're doing, but check how much freedom you have to reject suggestions.
Okay.
Also, because you don't want to have a situation where a publisher keeps throwing feedback to you. You get in a situation of scope creep, and then you don't hit your milestone schedule. And then in the end, that's your fault because it was your responsibility to bring the build to and achieve it before the deadline.
I see.
To recap, milestone schedule and feedback clauses. Watch out for those two and make sure that the milestone schedules are tight, but not too tight. So always make sure that it includes everything that's essential on a production level. 5 levels, 3 characters, alpha version, beta version, gold master version, but don't go too much in the direction of aesthetics.
Yeah, I see. Makes sense. We already mentioned and discussed a couple of bad contracts. Can you also give a real-life example, maybe of an agreement that worked out really well?
There are fairly balanced contracts. It's very hard to mention one example like, oh, that was a very good and balanced contract, because it could either be a situation where the first draft was very fair, or a draft where I want to give myself a pat on the shoulder because, oh my God, I did such a good job. However, there is one thing that I want to mention as a very green flag I saw, and because it's a very green flag, I'm also going to mention the name in there because it's no shaming, it is praising.
Okay.
And that was for the publisher Quali, because the publisher Quali has a provision in the contract which I didn't see that often, and that's that the publisher even gives you a budget to review your contract with a lawyer. And it was an unrecoupable budget. So they didn't even ask it to be recouped from the future revenue of the game. No, there was a budget with a certain limitation, like you can use this to negotiate the contract with a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
Of course, there is one small risk, and of course, is that if you don't come to an agreement, the budget is included in that agreement. So then you still need to finance it yourself. But the fact that a publisher says to you, we believe that the relationship is so important that we even are willing to pay a lawyer for you, and you can choose your own lawyer, because there were no criteria where they could say like, well, we don't want to pay that lawyer. No, it was literally like, if you can show us that you've paid a lawyer for the review, you just get that money from us back, and that's unrecoupable.
That's outstanding.
That's a green flag in my book. And it's not because I was happy as a lawyer that I got money from a publisher, but the fact that you actually indicate, I believe we're equal partners. And I believe that it's so important that we take this seriously, that if you need to make costs and you can't make them, I'll make them for you. I'll take my hat off for that. So shout out to Quali.
Crazy. Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, it's also much easier for the publisher if negotiating goes along, and if you can agree upon a contract that's great for both sides, and then if the relationship works out well without any hiccups or stress or any anger. So yeah, both sides just want the best, and it totally makes sense. But yeah, that's really an outstanding thing that they did. Really great.
Yeah, and of course, it indeed sometimes helps, because let's be honest to ourselves as well. Sometimes it's also not the easiest to negotiate with an indie. So it sometimes helps if they have professional help as well. So it is better for both parties in that way.
Yeah.
But that was something that at least surprised me in a positive way, especially we've discussed those myths. A publisher will be angry if I negotiate the contract. Some publishers give you money to do so.
Then one question again for your guide, the Game Developer's Guide to Publishing Agreements. Is it meant for devs worldwide, or is it only interesting for devs based in Europe?
It is specifically drafted to be interesting for developers worldwide. So
Okay.
the guide explicitly doesn't go into nitty-gritty details about legal differences between countries, but is meant to be an evergreen guide regardless of your region. Of course, we've negotiated a lot of different contracts in various regions, so of course that knowledge is included in there. But what you see is that publishing contracts have a certain global standard. And we focus on that global standard to make sure that developers are aware and have a useful tool, regardless if your publisher is from Germany, from France, from Australia, or the US.
Makes sense. Cool. That's very good to know. Also, looking into the future, is there a way to make contracts somewhat more accessible, or will they always be somewhat cryptic to non-lawyers?
I, I hope that contracts will be more accessible in the future. Law is also a craft, so I don't believe it will ever be fully understandable for non-legal people, the same as I will never fully understand software code and I should never program. Everyone has their own craft, but I would at least hope that having the possibility to get legal knowledge will be more accessible in the future. At least that's the mission of our firm. But just like the situation where you as an artist should never program yourself, I also don't believe that you should be legal yourself, but you should be happy that you're able to pay a programmer to do the programming for you. If you look at the legal profession, unfortunately, that has not always been the case because, like I said, lawyers are often deemed to be formal, elitist, expensive, and perhaps if that boring. And we at least hope that we and the new generation of lawyers at least helps to build a bridge with developers and make it in that way more accessible. And who knows what the future will hold? Perhaps we will all get a collective legal brain in the future and it will be like a skill like cycling. But until that moment, we hope to contribute like this.
I can definitely tell you that you're not boring. So-
Sheesh. I try to hide it.
You failed.
Sheesh, bummer.
I also have a couple of questions about yourself. I mean, you gave us so many insights about your work, so it would be great to get some insights about yourself and your career. I'm really interested in how you got started in the games industry and why you wanted to become a video game lawyer.
Yeah, for me, video games have always played an enormous big role in my life. So there are already pictures of me when I was 4 or 5 years old and I walked around with a Game Boy.
Aw.
I love to play. My first game was Tetris. That was too abstract for me. It became Super Mario. Then I got hooked. Got an SNES with Donkey Kong Country, and then I just was hooked and grew up to be a video game loving person. And I actually always wanted to be part of the video game industry, but at one point I could go to university, happened up to study law.
Mhm.
And then I actually, I studied law and I forgot that I could do something legal within the game industry. So I had actually two pillars in my life. It was video games and it was my profession. And funnily enough, I only discovered that I could combine the two as a result of a joke. I had a small kind of a contest with a colleague of mine at my previous law firm where we would pick up the phone. And every time we picked up the phone, we were never allowed to do the same greeting twice. That was the competition. If you would do the second greeting twice, then I would have won. And we did different cultural greetings, different languages. And at one moment, I was like, I'm going to call my colleague and I'm going to win now because I can't think of anything else he can say right now. And he picked up the phone and he was like, hello, game master. And I was like, geez, that's a lame excuse for a greeting, but hey. And then we concluded our conversation. I was like, game master, master in laws, games. why shouldn't I do video game law? And then I researched, and it's not a very huge thing. The industry is huge, but the group of dedicated video game lawyers is very small. So then I was like, why is that? Because I was like, is my idea so bad, or is there any other reason why there aren't that many? But there is just a big cultural misfit between the legal profession and video games. A lot of lawyers do not understand video games. Some think about them like, oh, video games are for children, so they look down on them. And some of them just don't blend in well with developers. And that was what I found out. And for me, I love to be a lawyer. I love the legal puzzles. But if I need to choose now between video games and legal, I would choose video games every time. And for me, so it's a dream that I can use my skill set, my legal skill set, to contribute to games. And for me, I actually never look back, and I'm just very happy that I can contribute in some way or another to this beautiful industry.
Oh, great. That's a great story. Yeah, I also discovered this because I've been a journalist before, and I've did all sorts of topics and interviews and things. And for years, I didn't think that I could combine my passion games with my job. It only came to me when I kind of ran out of topics. Like all the other colleagues, they were kind of grabbing everything that they could. So there was nothing or no work really left for me, but nobody really knew games. And I was like, well, why don't I do some reports and some coverage about the gaming industry and games itself? And that's how I converted then into being a games journalist. So yeah, it also took me a while to realize this.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And now when I look back, I'm really like, why did I realize it before? And of course, it was not easy to enter the industry. It really took some time and some effort. Because what I always say is that our industry is the best industry out there. Once you're in, you never get out. But it's also pretty hard to enter that industry. So that's also one of my personal goals. What I try to do is to network from my network a lot, to make sure to connect the unconnected, because I know how hard it is to enter the industry and to gain your first contacts. Because in the end, there are so many people who want to break in the industry, don't really know how to do that. So that's also one of my personal goals now, but also because for me, it took so long to realize it and then to subsequently really enter into the industry. Because as you can imagine, my first networking event as a lawyer in games was a moment to remember. I will never forget that I went to the Dutch Game Garden Network Launch, which is an event in the Netherlands, where like a local games gathering. And my first network launch, I still needed to wear a suit. I know, grave error, but that was the policy at my previous firm. And I went there in a suit, and I never forget that I only spoke with 2 people there. The first person came to me and they were like, "Hi, what are you doing here?" I'm like, "I'm a lawyer." "Oh, then you can help me with my bookkeeping." I was like, I should do that with an accountant if I were you. "Oh, a lawyer. Oh, yeah." And then there was a second person, and I never forget, that person handed me over their business card in the most polite way.
Oh,
And I was like, "Thank you." And that person was like, "Can I do an internship?" And I was like, what? I was like, "Yeah, I know where you are working. You work at Electronic Arts," because I learned that only people at EA wear suits.
oh no.
And I was like, "No, I'm actually a lawyer." And then you saw the disappointment in that person's face. That person really said like, "Oh, can I then have my business card back?" And that was my first ever event in the game industry. So now that I'm more of an insider, that I actually, know a lot of people here, I often remember those moments. And whenever I see someone walking around a little bit lost, I'm like, I want to prevent that person to give back business cards or believe they're an accountant. So I try to help them
that's
get a
nice.
foot in the industry.
That's sweet. Well, I can confirm right now you're not wearing a suit. So
Yet I'm even wearing this like a squirrel, so no problem.
nice. Yeah, you've also founded your law firm, as you've already mentioned, in March 2024, as far as I know. What encouraged you to take the step?
Yeah, for me, like I said, I've been working at a different law firm before I started my own law firm. So there was a traditional law firm in the Netherlands where I started as a trainee lawyer. I grew all the way to partner. And along the way, I decided that I wanted to focus on video games. However, I discovered more and more that I really loved to be in the games industry. And I didn't really necessarily felt that I fit in a traditional legal environment. And I also saw the contrast growing between my client base, who are their authentic self, and also myself, who love to be my unapologetic self, and what was expected from me in a more traditional legal environment. And I felt that misfits day in and out. And at one point, I just discovered for myself, because it was always my dream to become a partner at a traditional law firm. Then I became a partner at a traditional law firm. And I found out that I never really liked it.
Okay.
So please don't take this as a piece of advice like never achieve your dreams, because that sounds like a little bit dark. But at least my dream was not the dream, was not what I envisioned it. And then I just found out that I love my craft, but I hate traditional legal. So I actually want to say I hate lawyers, which is also a very interesting discussion, but we can fill a podcast about that. And I wanted to found my own law firm. And it's in the name, it like Deviant is being different. And we try to set a different standard for legal. So not only to be better connected to game developers, because again, we're a boutique firm focusing on the games industry, but we also want to give a place to call home to all those other lawyers who don't really believe they fit in. So that's actually our core story. We want to make legal more accessible for games, but at the same time, make sure that all those a little bit more quirky lawyers who love games can actually join our firm and help this amazing industry. So that was actually my goal. And of course, I've been so scared when I took that step, because of course you're leaving a comfortable position. I couldn't been at the firm where I was until I was gray and old. But it just didn't feel like that for me. I just didn't want to do that, because what I also discovered was that I had so many ideas like, oh my God, the games industry would benefit from A or benefit from B. And then often I got a response like, okay, but that just doesn't fit in our general strategy and we're still a law firm. And then I was like, yeah, but why can't we do that? And if you have done at least 5 or 6 times, you're out.
Okay.
You're out. Then you're literally like, okay, in that case, why don't I do it myself? Because you keep daydreaming about those, what if I could do it? And then you slowly float towards something that then became Deviant Legal. And yeah, actually never look back. It's like the 2-year anniversary this month, and time flew by. And what I'm happy about, and I'm also proud of, is that it is even a better fit with the games industry than before, because I gained a lot of new clients who just said like, I always knew that you were a video game lawyer, but now if I visit your website, it also breeds games. So it's not, I don't only see what you say, but I also experience it.
Yeah.
When I started out, I started my own firm, I was scared like, oh, will people still want to work with me when I don't have that backing from that big, serious, well-known 70 years existing law firm? But it was the other way around. I found out that the games industry is more anarchistic than I would believe, because they don't really believe in the system. they believe in working with people.
That's true. Yes, nice. And your company also has a mascot, an otter. What's the backstory here?
Yeah, I need to explain that a lot, especially to traditional lawyers who really look at me like with a big question mark above their heads. Um, I've had that mascot actually even before I started Deviant Legal. So the mascot is older than the law firm.
Oh, right.
And the reason for that is that the mascot was a gift from one of my clients. So I had an indie developer who had a sticky legal situation. And despite the situation being rather sticky, I helped them achieve their goals.
Mhm.
And that was just a client relationship. So we of course stayed in touch, but I never really expected something until at one moment they sent me concept art. And I was like, what is this? And they were like, yeah, we were so happy with what you've done that we decided to honor you as an NPC in our game. So
Oh.
it's an NPC in the game Nairi Rising Tides. I would really check it out. But all of those NPCs in Nairi are animals. So they were like, yeah, we should also make an animal out of you. So it has become Otto the Otter. And I always used it as a mascot. But when I started my own firm, I decided to let it be not like my personal NPC, but rather let it be a mascot for our firm, because I also believe that the otter illustrates what we stand for as a firm. Because not only the story, because the background story also tells the situation where we helped an indie dev, but also if you look at an otter, it's not something that you would typically see as an animal for a law firm, although the otter is actually a perfect mascot for a law firm who tries to break the mold. And that's why in the end we reached out to the indie developer, like, we're very thankful that you included me as a mascot or as an NPC in your game, but are we allowed to use it as a mascot for a law firm? And they were like, oh, we would love to, because in the end it was also a tribute to you. So then we, of course, as lawyers do, obtain the license to use it, and also have an arrangement that whenever we need to have different versions of the other, that we will actually engage the original artist and pay her for her contributions, because we believe paying your artist is important as well. But in this way, we have a win-win. We have our awesome mascot, who wasn't designed by a kind of a marketing firm as a gimmick. No, it has a genuine story behind it.
Yes.
It also fits with our values, and the original artists also benefit from it. And do we sometimes get strange looks from traditional law firms?
Probably, but who cares?
Yes. There's no better feeling than to win a court case from a traditional law firm and then needing to visit your website and see a quirky otter. You are served.
Yeah, welcome to the games industry. Nice. Oh, that's great.
I sometimes want to have the camera images of those persons after such a court case then visiting the website. But you can't have all in life.
That's true. Oh. I also wanted to ask you, what's the best part of being a video game lawyer and what's the most challenging?
Oh, the best part of being a video game lawyer for me remains the idea that you actually contributed to a game. So especially when you are involved with a publishing deal and subsequently the game is being shipped and you get a copy and you play through it and you see your name in the credits, that's a feeling that never gets old. So that's literally the best feeling there is. The worst thing of being a video game lawyer perhaps is the current industry climate.
Okay.
As a lawyer, you have work in good times and in bad times. But if you look at the current games industry climate and see how many developers are suffering to find funding or need to cease operating the studio because the game didn't do as well as they hoped it would, it also shatters you a little bit. So I really hope that better times are coming for games. I already see it in my practice. So I see still a lot of game publishing agreements being signed. So I hope that's an indication that we're at least on the road to success again. But sometimes that worries me, because the good thing about being a video game lawyer, is that you care. The bad side of being a video game lawyer is that you're also caring and feeling too much when it goes a little bit less with our industry. So that's at least something that, well, on a weekly basis impacts me, because for every beautiful story about success you also, especially in these times, hear less favorable stories, and you see people who couldn't make it, or people who lost their job. And I'm the kind of lawyer, of course I do litigation, of course I do all kind of other stuff, but the positive legal in the games industry is, of course, the most satisfying legal to do. If at the end of a long working day, you can say like, wow, we closed an investment deal, or wow, we closed a publishing deal, you feel way better than when you need to say, well, it was a redundancy and 20 people needed to be let go.
Yeah, that's harsh.
That never feels good.
Yeah, for sure. Let's hope the situation will definitely improve and people stop losing their jobs.
I hope so.
If you could send a message back in time when you've started out as a lawyer, what would you write?
Run. No. Run away from being a lawyer. No. On a more serious note, I think there is a message I would send not only to young lawyer René, but even to young René. And perhaps a lot of game developers who are listening can relate, but on a personal level, I really struggled fitting it. I was personally raised in a trailer camp in a very loving family, but I was, in my family, I always believed that I was a little bit the odd one out there, because I was the one who loved to study, and I love video games, and my family just had different interests. So I felt a little bit the odd one out there. At school, at high school, at university, I also felt the odd one out there, because in the end, I was that boy who grew up at a trailer camp. So you live in different worlds. And I always felt like I didn't really 100% belong in the one world or the other.
Yeah.
And that changed when I entered the games industry, because I always say this, and I say it in a loving way, but in a pond of odd ducks, an odd duck fits in.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I would love to say to my former self that being different should not be seen as a liability. Because if you're young, everything that makes you different makes you sad, because you're like, I'm not like everyone else. You were different because of A, B, and C, are actually later down the line your superpowers. You ask like, what would you say to young lawyer René? But I also want to say to young René, because also when I became a lawyer, I was like, I'm not really feeling like the other lawyers. Am I even a lawyer? You got a kind of an existential crisis, because there were so many different reasons why I felt like a fake lawyer, which are now my USPs while having my own law firm. So perhaps it's not even a message to young me, but to young everyone who listens. Like, if you ever feel like the odd one out there, know that what makes you feel odd are actually your USPs, and never hiding for anyone.
That's a good point. Yes, for sure. Yeah, I always also can relate to that feeling as the odd one when I was younger. I didn't have any gamer friends back then when I was young, so that only developed later. But it felt like there was something wrong with me, you know. Like, I need to be different, but just don't change. There are people, there is a community where you definitely fit in. You just need to search for it. And then when you're in, you feel great.
Yeah, I to be honest, I never felt better than being in games, and that's also the strange situation for me because I have clients, but most of my clients are also my friends, such as the other
Oh.
people in the community I don't work with, but I just vibe with, and that's still something that I never expected when I started working, let alone being a video game lawyer.
What moment in your journey as a lawyer will you always remember? Or is it that Dutch event where you were?
Yeah, that's the trauma that I will always remember. It's the scar on my chest. I can't get rid of it. Now, for me, there are several moments. Some of them I unfortunately can't discuss, but the most important moment is one I can discuss. And I believe it was, for me, the most pivotal moment in my legal career. And I believe around 2019, I started to work with Vertigo Games, which is one of the largest developers of VR games. And I've been closely involved with them since then. And I remember that one day I went to the beach and I read a little book about the history of guerrilla games, which, of course, in the Netherlands is one of our, well, gems. I mean, they make Horizon, they make beautiful AAA games. So I read that book and I was like, oh, it would have been so awesome to do a case like that, but because it was about guerrilla games being acquired by Sony. And I never forget that I left the beach, went on barbecuing, and when it was like almost dark, I got a WhatsApp message from Richard, who is the CEO of Vertigo Games, like, "Hey René, do you also do company takeovers?" And I was like, "What?" It was like, "Yeah, we do that. Oh, can I call you? I have a fun one for you." And then he told me that Vertigo Games, and it's out in the public, would be acquired for 150 million by Embracer. And I was flabbergasted. I was like, don't you need to perhaps also ask other law firms and check who you feel most comfortable with? And it was like, no, I like you. I'm going to work with you. And I was so shocked. Also, very strange that on the same day I read that book, a similar case can be really the second biggest game company takeover we've seen, and in the Netherlands. And then I did that case, and for me, it was pivotal for two reasons. One, we concluded that deal, and of course, Vertigo Games would be acquired by Embracer. So I calculated the risk that I would lose my client relationship because, well, if you're part of a big international company, they have their own legal departments. What do you need me for? However, we still kept working together after that, just because he said, like, you are just a part of us. You're also a part of Vertigo. So we just will keep working together. So that really touched me emotionally. And from a work relation perspective, it set things in motion because people were like, oh, if you can do a deal of 150 million, you can potentially also do my deal, which it doesn't mean that a deal of 150 million is necessarily more complex than publishing deal of 1 million, but at least it's the general assumption of a public, like, hey, if you can do cases with such a deal size, you can also do my case, which just led to more trust. It was the kind of validation that skyrocketed my career and made sure that in a few years I started to win awards. I was included in a lot of lists and everything. But it all started with Vertigo Games trusting me to do that one case, because that was a portfolio piece that was very important for my future career. And that's also, in hindsight, why I'm such an advocate of making sure that all game developers are also included in the credits of a video game, because apparently having a solid portfolio is key.
Oh, that's a nice story. What's one advice you have for indies who are looking for funding and finding a publisher?
One of the things that I would advise indies, and they do not naturally focus on it, but one, start networking when you do not need it. Start building relationships. Of course, most indies are naturally introverted, but it's actually very good to start networking and getting to know publishers the moment you're already early in development. And then you perhaps don't have a game to show, but you can at least get to know them, know how they work at the moment when it's not yet urgent. Because I also see a lot of indie developers entering into suboptimal deals because of time pressure, because the funds are running out. So that's a very important one. The second one is for indies to keep realizing that what they are doing is worthwhile and valuable. And also, that should be included in your pitch as well. I see a lot of indie developers who are saying like, we are an unfunded indie and we're looking for money. And then they've worked for 3 years on a video game. And then I'm like, yeah, but if you calculate the value of the sweat equity you invested, why did you tell a publisher like, we invested 3 years of our time, which equals to amount X in this game, and we are also looking for an additional, I would say, 300K in investment. Then you also set a realistic narrative, because there's nothing as valuable as time, where you can better negotiate a deal. Because if you set the narrative, we did everything for free and now we want the real monies, then your negotiation position is different. I'm not saying this because you need to have the best position and negotiate as good as you can for yourself. Of course, you need to negotiate as good as you can for yourself, but also because I believe a lot of indies are heavily underselling themselves and don't realize how much their effort, their creativity, and their time has value. And I believe that more indies should at least know that when they pitch. They should at least communicate that, because in that case, you can at least show what risks you've taken, what you've invested. And I believe that's also worthwhile, because sometimes I see the best games with the worst pitches.
That's very good advice. René, what's next for you?
Oh, well. Like I said, Deviant Legal is turning 2 this month, and we're actually rapidly growing.
Nice.
There will be a very important marketing beat for us on March 25.
Okay.
Because then the Legal 500 will be released, and the Legal 500 is kind of the Michelin guide for lawyers. And I've been personally ranked for the past 6 years, but we've also found out that there is quite a good chance that we will be ranked with Deviant Legal for the first time, and also with pretty high grades.
Okay.
So we will try to see what comes out of there, celebrate it, and see where it will bring us. Because for us, it also helps that we have tangible proof, that we have validation from different sources, so that if people have a great feeling with us, it sometimes also helps if they can see reviews, if they can see public sources.
Makes sense.
So with those two things in mind, we will try to build towards a better future. And what we are going to do next, at least, is to disrupt the practice of video game trademarks, because a lot of indie developers don't register their video game trademarks because they feel a misfit with current trademark companies. And we will offer a trademark service soon. And we will also develop some proprietary software specifically aimed at the games industry to better protect your own IP. So not general software that can also be used for games, but specifically, in this case, for video game industry, for trademarks. And we try to disrupt that part of the sector as well to also make that more accessible. So I wouldn't be surprised if within now and a few months there will be another 20,000 word guide, with then not on publishing contracts, but on the usages of trademarks, why you should register, why you shouldn't, in which classes, when should I do it, all those kinds of questions. So there will be more guides, there will be more tools which are free to use for developers soon.
Nice.
And hopefully will help the industry get to a better place.
Oh, that's great. Well, so many plans. And yeah, definitely keep an eye on the website of Deviant Legal. And we for sure will check out your guides that's coming up. And yeah, René, this was our very first Behind the Build episode here on Open Indie, in which we dive into specific aspects of game development. And René Otto today on the show, he shared his insights into publishing agreements and the pitfalls indie developers should be aware of. And as a video game lawyer, René also created a guide to help developers make sense of their contracts with publishers. Thank you so much, René, today for being on the show and to share your insights.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be the test subject of this new format.
Great. Everyone, please also check out our other episodes, discover indie games and indie dev stories on the Open Indie podcast. And please support us and follow us on Blue Sky. Thank you.